We are recording as far as I can tell. Um, let's hope so. So just to start, my name is Donna Royal. I'm a senior evidence analyst for Penn, and this is the first of hopefully will be two authors training webinars in terms of developing or updating content for Penn. And I have a couple of participants, and so we will hopefully get some interesting questions and discussion going as well. The evidence-based information cycle consists of these 5 A's, and today really going to be focusing just on two of them: asking the question and acquiring the evidence. So, asking the question, we know there's that the busy clinician doesn't have time to search through every to ask questions and find relevant research efficiently. So we're really, one of the keys to efficiency is to really ask a focused question. So asking the research question. There are two types of questions. There's the background questions that are more focused on general knowledge and conditions and regulations. We have templates for that, which I'll show you in just a moment. And then there's the foreground questions that are more relate to more specialized knowledge about choices and decision making. What's the most effective or what's the safest option. And for that, I'll be talking a little bit more about Penn PICO questions. So background and foreground questions. So first of all, if we look at an example of current questions in Penn, are women with polycystic ovary syndrome, or PCOS, at higher risk of comorbid conditions than women without PCOS? So would that be a background or a foreground question? Anyone want to jump in?
What do you think, Megan?
I would say that is a background question.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I don't want to, if we're talking about things like medical conditions, comorbidities, it's, that's the sort of thing, you might look up in a textbook, what's the prevalence of comorbid conditions along with PCOS, right? And it may not guide your treatment so much as if you were to say this next question, which is, are there any dietary supplements that can help manage symptoms and comorbidities of PCOS, right? So then we're really looking, okay, so what specific interventions can we use for treating the condition? So the difference between background and foreground questions. Not that background questions are less important, but we put them in a different place in Penn. So we have background content for each topic. And so these templates are the general headings that we would use to put background information. So on the left side of your screen, you're seeing a non-disease related template. We might use this for a specific nutrient or plant proteins or food security, would sort of be a non-disease condition. And so, we include information, about why is this an important topic? What's the overview? Some basic relevant information. And links to resources for professionals. Clinical templates on the right side of your screen are cover topics like what's the etiology, how would we screen or diagnose the condition, what's the prevalence, what are the symptoms, what are the comorbidities, associated diseases, and medical treatment. So those that aren't specifically related to a dietitian's role. So those templates just show you the type of information we include in background information, and they are in Penn for most topics. And an important part of understanding a topic. But we really will, and we actually have some information sources that you would go to. I said textbook. We have some electronic versions. Of resources that we can link to for this type of information. And so there is on our resource guide, which I'll be showing you towards the end, more information on background information sources for many of these topics. We're really going to be focusing, though, in this webinar about focusing on PICO questions, Penn PICO questions. And so when we're talking about PICO, the P for population is how would you define the population, either by demographics or medical condition. When you're thinking about the intervention or exposure of interest, what is the specific intervention we're talking about? Presumably a dietary intervention. Is there a comparison condition to compare it to? And outcomes. Outcomes, what do we hope to accomplish, approve, or affect? And in particular, we always want to be reminding ourselves what outcomes are important to patients or clients, not sort of more obscure outcomes, things that can really have an impact on their functional status, their quality of life, their admission to hospital, that sort of thing. So when we're talking about developing content or updating content, the first step in terms of looking at Penn practice questions is we're really focusing on foreground questions. Background information can go in the background document, but we really are looking at, in the Penn questions, foreground questions. And it's important to look to see what is currently in Penn on the topic. There can be a lot of enthusiasm about a specific topic an individual has been researching, but what is in Penn on the topic, and can that information be updated, or can similar PICO questions be combined so we're not having redundancy, repetition, inconsistencies. And that really speaks to sometimes questions can be combined if we're looking at broader patient important outcomes. Do we really need a specific question on, soy and the effects on reproduction in PICO, in polycystic ovary syndrome, or could we look very broadly at the effects of soy on, the other symptoms or outcomes associated with the condition? So broader important outcomes are important to look at altogether when we're trying to come up with a recommendation. And finally, the question should be relevant. So in particular, focusing on a dietary issue within a dietitian's scope of practice is one way to think about relevance. So, other ways to think about it is how available, for example, would the intervention be, or how obscure is the population, or how generalizable is it?
And Donna, if
Yes.
if you found other questions that were currently in Penn that could not be combined with the question that you're currently writing, then you would just link to those in the remarks section, correct?
Yes, yeah. So in fact, if there's other potentially, important questions that relate to the one that you're doing, yeah, we can certainly link to that within a question. The second webinar that I'm planning is really talking about putting the evidence into a Penn context, and that's a good point. We want to be able to link to other relevant content. Yeah. Okay, thanks. So thinking then broadly about what the topic or the question would be, the next step is to acquire the evidence. So the goal in searching is really looking at the best available evidence, not every shred of evidence on a particular topic. So I'm really going to be talking about acquiring or conducting the literature search to really focus on finding the best available evidence. So conducting the literature search, the first step, of course, is defining the topic and thinking about the PICO question. And I think when we think about PICO questions, and we always put, population intervention, comparison, and outcome together. But for us, in terms of a search, it's really much better to focus just on the main concepts, which generally are population and intervention. So as relates to our previous example, we're looking at population very generally about being polycystic ovary syndrome. And the intervention, said dietary supplements that could include vitamins, minerals, herbs, how we're thinking about what a dietary supplement might be. And so to combine those main concepts, I'm just saying, we'll be using and as that Boolean connector to look at the population and the intervention together to focus our search. So the main concepts, and then starting to look for other search terms. And for this, I'll take you to an example of looking in PubMed at the MESH database. The MESH database helps us to find the terms in the literature, how articles are indexed in PubMed. So let's go have a look at the MESH database. All right, are you seeing my slide on the PubMed slide? So in PubMed, then we're looking at this link directly to the MESH database. And so you start to enter some of these terms to see if in fact they are termed the way that information is indexed in PubMed. So let's just start with polycystic ovary syndrome and see what comes up in our search. And sure enough, that is an index term. So that would be a very appropriate one to use. You can see that there's some other terms that might be related to it, or, Stein-Leventhal syndrome, polycystic ovarian syndrome, but that hopefully would show up if you did a search on polycystic ovary syndrome, but but may not, because the MESH index term is polycystic ovary syndrome, which falls under ovarian cysts, the general category of ovarian cysts. So that pretty much encompasses our population. Let's look at how we would capture dietary supplements for the intervention. Oh, okay, so dietary supplements is a MESH term as well. And you can see that other things that would be included under dietary supplements could be prebiotics, probiotics, symbiotics, and yeast. But we're really not seeing things like vitamins and minerals and herbs in here, although maybe herbal supplements would show up. So we want to make sure we capture vitamins. So if we do a search on vitamins does show up as a MESH term, so that would be another good MESH term to include. It's not listing all the specific vitamins. It might be more appropriate to just to look at a specific vitamin. You could start very broad though with vitamins, and similar with minerals or mineral. So minerals is another MESH term, and you can see that there are several minerals listed in here. What about some other things that maybe, so we've got dietary supplements, vitamins, minerals, natural health products maybe? Not a MESH term. Now that could potentially be a useful word to include, a text word to include, but it isn't being captured as a MESH term. So we'd call that a text word. Any other thoughts about other search terms that we could be looking for as a MESH term to capture the dietary supplement piece?
I always look at the current question and see if there are any specifics. So like if the current question talked about vitamin A, then I would search for vitamin A, for instance.
Yeah. That's a good point. I mean, in fact, if there's a whole, content in pen on inositol and polycystic ovary syndrome, you'd want to be looking at that specific compound or some sort of other plant. We didn't actually look up any herbs, did we? So herb doesn't come up except for herb-drug interaction. So perhaps plants medicinal would be one to capture something more broad than those specific dietary supplements. So I'm going to take us back to the PowerPoint. And as we're starting to look for these terms, we're entering the mesh terms and the text words on the search strategy that we've got. So at the very beginning of the search strategy, you can see at the bottom, it's just starting to identify the mesh terms and the text words. Another way to find some other useful information is to actually start doing a mini search on what you've got. So going to clinical queries. Clinical queries are a great way to target clinical questions to find systematic reviews. So if we can find something that's already been published as a systematic review and see what other terms were used in that review or what other similar articles there are, that's another way to hone in on the search. So let's go back to our PubMed and look at PubMed clinical queries and try polycystic ovary syndrome and dietary supplements. Those were the two mesh terms. You can see that I'm not putting any mesh headings with these. I'm just using the terms that they were indexed with. If I restricted it to putting a symbol after it showing it was a mesh heading, it may not identify the most recent literature that hasn't been indexed. So doing it this way does help to identify all of the most recent information. Oh, well, look at that. We have some, first of all, some systematic reviews that came up and then some primary studies. So first of all, I'd like to look at these systematic reviews and see if there's anything very general that would, some of them are looking at specific supplements. There's only 16 that came up, so not a huge volume when we searched for dietary supplements. Let's sort them by the most recent. And we're getting into specific nutrients here. Here's one that's very general, nutrition supplements and herbal medicines for women with polycystic ovary syndrome, a systematic review and meta-analysis. So that really piques my interest. It looks like it might cover quite a wide variety. And so if we look at that particular article and scroll down, we can see what other similar articles there might be. Here's an older one from 2014. Here's one that is a primary study, a randomized trial, and then another systematic review on a specific nutrient. So similar articles can sometimes help to find what else has been, what might have been published in the topic. And then let's look at the mesh terms that were used for this one. So dietary supplements were used. Phytotherapy, perhaps not so relevant. Plant preparations. Polycystic ovary syndrome was used, and they used vitamins as well. So this other way of finding, sorry, I thought I was going to take us back to the beginning of our the PowerPoint, but I got us where I wanted to be. So as we're starting to search using our clinical queries, here's just that example of that study, going to it to actually find where there are similar articles and other mesh terms. So we start to then expand the search terms, so adding more mesh terms as we find them, and text words that come up. And the text words, PCOS, it might be listed as that. I've got ovarian syndrome, Stein-Leventhal syndrome. Those were text words that weren't identified as mesh terms. I caution you a little bit about using too many combinations together. If we were to connect all of the population terms together using or, polycystic ovary syndrome, or PCOS, or polycystic ovarian syndrome, or Stein-Leventhal syndrome, and then we start combining it with all of the terms for the interventions, it can start to limit it too much, limit the search too much. So it is good to keep a broad search and start to narrow it as too much information comes forth. So yes, we did a little search on polycystic ovary syndrome and dietary supplements. We could try polycystic ovary or Stein-Leventhal, and then combine those with, plants, medicinal plant preparation. Complementary therapies was another one that came up as a mesh term. So doing several little searches, but really focusing on that systematic, initially where those systematic reviews are, can really help to hone in on the best available evidence. And we're documenting this information on our search strategy, the mesh terms, the text words, the databases. So at a minimum, looking at doing a PubMed search. The rest of the search strategy we'll get to when we talk about reasons for excluding reviews, when we're really looking at identifying the studies to include. So we'll take a pause on that. So after starting to do the search and identify these words, a really great thing, we're really trying to, as I said, identify the best available evidence. And that generally starts with looking at secondary sources. So we're not doing systematic reviews ourselves. It takes an awful lot to do a systematic review. Usually takes, more than one person to screen all the articles, to do a quality appraisal on all the articles, decide which will be included, potentially do a meta-analysis on them. So where we can find this work that has been done by others, that's far better to include. It is better to just find the, be careful about not including multiple systematic reviews, because many of the same articles might be included in them. So really trying to find a systematic review or guidelines that are based on a systematic review that are, the most recent, the highest quality, and that are really most closely represented by that PICO question. And meta-analysis are preferred over narrative reviews if that's possible to do. I will talk about a little bit more about the quality of systematic reviews when we look at really honing through and putting together the topics in our next webinar. Another secondary source could be a narrative review. Caution about narrative reviews that sometimes they can be very opinion-based. So if a narrative review is included, it should have a search strategy and be balanced and objective. But again, someone has gone to the work of identifying the literature on the topic, and where that can be summarized using a narrative review, that's helpful. Primary sources can be used and should be used, certainly if there is no secondary source, or if there's some information that's more recent than the review. And we'll be looking at making sure that it's a high quality primary study if it's included. So again, not identifying every shred of evidence. So we'll look at another example, which is a non-clinical example, and ask ourselves, are these background or foreground questions? So a couple of examples here. What are the health implications for people experiencing food insecurity? Background or foreground?
Background?
Yeah, background. You know, this could be the importance of the topic to practice, or some relevant basic information, you know, if health implications, you know, are identified. What are the health issues? So good information to include in a background document. And then another question, do programs that improve food skills reduce the severity of food insecurity? More of an foreground question. It's really an intervention. Do programs that address food insecurity and improve food skills really have an impact on food insecurity? So we could consider that to be a foreground question that we're looking for the evidence. So let's have a look then at some of the MeSH terms that might be included for this topic. Let's just try very broadly food insecurity. So we do a search on food insecurity, and interestingly, it's not a MeSH term. Food supply is the MeSH term, which is interesting. I'm sure it would be the same if we looked at, let's try food security. Same thing, food supply. Any other suggestions when we're thinking about not the intervention, but the population? Other suggestions for a MeSH term that we could look for to address food insecure population?
Could you look specifically at a population that's being impacted by food security, or
Okay, so for example,
maybe Indigenous populations?
okay, let's just do very broadly Indigenous. So there is Indigenous peoples. So that's a MeSH term, encompasses potentially a lot of other descriptors here. So yes, in this case, you'd probably be looking at a question specifically for that population, or that could be an aspect of a question on food insecurity specifically for that food skills or food programs specifically for that population. What about low income? So low income comes up as a MeSH term as poverty. So that might be something, another way to capture as well the population. What about some suggestions for what could we be looking for to address the intervention, which is programs that improve food skills? Any suggestions for what we could look up here?
Could you just search food skills?
Mm-hmm. Nothing. Anything else?
Community gardens.
Okay. I'll just keep it garden and see what comes up. No.
Maybe just gardens.
Garden? Gardens, places provided for the cultivation and or display of plants. Okay. I just, as we're thinking about, you know, dietitians and that, you know, what about meal preparation or something like that? Just see what comes up here. Food services, probably not so relevant.
Just cooking or intervention, like keep it really broad, maybe.
So cooking, yeah, food handling, cooking, cookbooks as topics.
Just food.
Yeah. See what comes up under food. A variety of food sources. I'm just looking at everything that's captured under food, but it's not really the meal the food, the meal preparation aspect of it.
Right.
So while we're here on the PubMed site, let's move from the MESH term to a systematic review search. And we could try, sorry, I guess I need to get to the, so we're back at clinical queries here. We could try the food supply as the MESH term. And let's just try the food skills. It wasn't a MESH term, but we could see what comes up. Oh, interesting. So we are getting some searches, even though it wasn't identified as a MESH term. So are there any that, so we're starting to focus on the some of the indigenous populations here in this one. There's only 8 that came up. Let's try our more, instead of the food supply, maybe more of our text words, because food supply wasn't really addressing the population very well, right? So if we actually go back to try food security, insecurity, and food skills, let's see if something, early childhood development, so that's really not about an intervention. Oh, a systematic review of food pantry-based interventions in the US. So if we have a look at that, let's see some, if there's other similar articles, and let's see what this one doesn't have MESH terms listed with it for it, likely because it's too new to be indexed. That might be a reason, but there are no MESH terms, but we could certainly see a potential for this one, and outcomes of a disease prevention and management interventions, a scoping review here, a review of food security, diet, and health outcomes of food pantry clients and the potential. So, there's some possibilities there, but realizing that, we are, dietary quality of food pantry users. That's only looking at dietary quality. That's an older one from 2017. We'll just see if it's got MESH terms on it. Okay, it does. So they're looking specifically, though food supply is included, but they're looking specifically at nutrients and foods. So not really capturing the food insecurity as much. So based on this, you can start to be putting together the expanded search terms. So these were the only limited MESH terms that came up: food supply, poverty, and cooking. And then some of these other text words that could be combined as well to look at other aspects that weren't otherwise identified as MESH terms. Any sort of questions or comments on that search strategy for this topic? Yeah, okay. So having done a couple of pretty varied searches and sort of identifying some potentials and some challenges as well, the next step in looking at incorporating literature or looking at international recommendations. And so in particular, PEN partners are Dietitians Australia, Dietitians of Canada, and the British Dietetic Association. So looking to see what government guidelines might be on this topic. So the NHMRC in Australia, the Canadian Task Force on Preventive Healthcare in Canada, or NICE guidelines in the UK are good places to look to see if there are any guidelines. Guidelines don't always show up in PubMed. So looking at the specific guidelines to see what's there, and in particular guidelines that are based on systematic reviews and graded and have graded recommendations can be a very good way of also seeing how the evidence relates to the evidence that you found relates to other country recommendations. Particularly for disease conditions, but it could encompass a variety of, what organizations within those countries as well could be addressing, for example, food insecurity, but also looking at clinical practice guidelines from national professional associations. So what are these countries releasing related to these medical conditions? Talked generally about or used a couple of examples of how the search could be narrowed if it was too large, or expanded if it was too narrow. And although I didn't go through the example, when I did that search on polycystic ovary syndrome, and I added too many dietary interventions together, dietary supplements or vitamins or minerals, it narrowed it too much. So it was better to keep it very broad rather than adding too many options for interventions. On the other hand, if it gets to be too much information, certainly looking at the systematic reviews does really help to narrow it down and finding those that could be related. But we want to make sure we're not limiting ourselves too much to be able to identify those the systematic reviews that might have been indexed differently. So trying a variety of search terms. We do have some other more detailed information on in our PEN authors and reviewers guides on acquiring evidence and a search strategy worksheet. I'll just show you. So on the PEN website here, under our PEN authors and reviewers resources, there's lots of information. So there's instructions on acquiring evidence and a training module about searching PubMed that provides a little more detailed information. Here's the search strategy worksheet in here as well. I should mention as well, when I was talking about government guidelines, PEN does have international guidelines collections on specific topics. So as opposed to looking at the dietary reference values, for example, for every country for a specific nutrient, we can link to the information in PEN on where the dietary reference values can be obtained for each of the countries. So I would put this together as a summary and then ask if this really does capture it according to your understanding. When you've got sort of the topic, the foreground question, really finding the terms for the population and the intervention variables, preparing a list of the mesh terms and the text words, combining the terms using that Boolean connector and looking for filtered literature, focusing on systematic reviews and guidelines that are based on systematic reviews first. If you haven't found anything or enough in the filtered literature, looking at primary studies with limits. Didn't really talk about that too much, but the primary studies, maybe we can just go back to an example of some of the information that I found to if we're looking at primary studies here, this was on food insecurity and food skills, systematic review is coming up here. Let's see if we find something that's a little more, I'm just going to, this may not, but it's a primary study. When we're listing all of these primary studies together, we can start to only look at those, for example, that are clinical trials or randomized trials. We could look at something that's just in the last 5 years to narrow it down a bit. And if we're looking for additional information, if we want to look at anything that's, for example, only in the English language. So we're down to only 7 that meet that criteria. So that's sort of a way of adding limits when you're looking at the primary literature to really focus it a little more carefully. Although this one, yes, I'm not sure if that's in English or not, but okay. And finally, then documenting the search strategy using that search strategy form that I was showing you and is available on the Penn website. I alluded to there's also a searching PubMed. There's some other training modules as well that provide evidence-based process, provides an overview. These are PowerPoints that have notes below them to read. So that provides an overview of the evidence-based process, more detailed information on asking the question. And next webinar, I'll be looking a little bit more detail about appraising the literature, so assigning grades to the study and looking at study designs. Something I forgot to mention, I did want to mention, is as you're starting to find these studies, and I'll take us back to the PubMed website. And you know, starting to put them together on a, I'll just take this example. So when you start to find a study, I talked about doing a search, and you know, this could be potentially really good. Then what do you do with that? So really good idea to start to put it together on a spreadsheet. This was one about the polycystic ovary syndrome. But if we want to just take this information here, take this citation, this is a perfect way to use the information for referencing in Penn. Just copy this citation into a Word document and sort of under your category of, this would be under food pantry. Right? And so you've captured your citation there. Also in Penn, we do use the, you know, to make it the retrieval that much better, also using the PubMed URL and adding that. And so even though you may not choose to include this at the end, you're at least starting to filter and identify the best evidence under this topic. And the topic might range from, you know, the specific intervention, or when we found that one on Aboriginal, it might fall under the, you know, put another category. This would be one to consider. So putting them together on a Word document really helps you to, you know, to capture them very easily, so they're not getting you know, lost, and then you can review it in more detail as you're deciding which ones you will be including in Penn. Okay, well, that ends this webinar. I encourage you to take an opportunity now to ask for questions or clarifications before you start on your journey of doing the search on the particular topic and putting it together in a Word document before ultimately writing the content for a Penn question. So yes, comments or feedback.
That was really helpful. Thank you, Donna. I do have one question just about the databases. So you recommend searching first in PubMed. Do you have other database recommendations beyond PubMed? I find it tends to be a bit more clinical and less public health. If there's other databases you have suggestions for Penn content, that would be great.
Thanks for that. Certainly, I agree with you. And so it is more clinically focused. We do use another one in Penn, which is TRIP database. It is by subscription, though. Some people that have access to other libraries might be able to, CINAHL might broaden the search a little bit beyond more the medical focused as well. And so you might get more relevant information. I'd say though, and TRIP database in particular can help to identify some of those guidelines that that you don't that may not show up in PubMed. And another way really is looking at the topic through those government guidelines, or where you're seeing grey literature. There's a question about grey literature and how relevant it might be, but you might find some other good references within that grey literature that have been used to that could be incorporated. So yes, particularly for the non-clinical topics, it would be good to expand beyond PubMed.
I read an article, and this isn't specific to public health, but just in general, using both PubMed and Google Scholar together yields as many results as 6 or 8 databases together. So, I mean, again, it's not necessarily going to get you public health specific stuff, but it'll probably get you quite a few hits.
Yes, yeah. Google Scholar doesn't have quite the same search abilities as PubMed in terms of what we talked about, but certainly when you're finding you're just it's too narrowed, you're really struggling for it, which I think we were seeing a little bit for the food insecurity topic, that it would be worth having a look in Google Scholar. Thanks for that. Okay, well, thank you very much. Hopefully this you will have an opportunity to come be social with Penn, and hopefully this is a good launch pad to, as I said, doing the literature, starting a literature search on a topic, and starting to organize it before we actually get into evaluating it, critically appraising it, and putting the content into a Penn format question. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hold on for a moment. I'm going to oh, okay, sorry, just trying to find out. I'm on a different screen here.